they're going. Glad to see you tonight on this first night of the new, the next. And those watching by way of live streaming on the Facebook, YouTube, good to have you tonight. Again, as we always say, if you're new to this series on faith in the founding of the Bible and the Constitution, if you want these notes that we provide every Wednesday night, just email the office. That's office@gcotv.org. That's office@gcotv.org, and we'll get them emailed back to you. All right, everybody got notes that needs them? Session 8 will go for, I think, another 3 weeks or so. It's not that we're going to exhaust this, because you could go 77 weeks on the Constitution and not even scratch the surface. So that's all we're going to even begin to remotely do, scratch the surface. Tonight's going to be a civics class. Everybody remember your civics class? Don't dial out now and say, well, gosh, I wish I'd stayed home and watched the Reds. The gift of liberty was purchased for us with great sacrifice. John Adams, in a letter to his wife Abigail in 1777, reminds us of that. He says, "Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half of the pains to preserve it." Adams was serious about the Constitution. He was serious about the Constitution. Now, we're seeing today rampant with all the other things going on in terms of the chaos and riots and attacking federal buildings. You see the pulling down of statues all over the United States. Here's a fundamental mistake that these folks are making. They're saying these people were flawed. Of course they were flawed, just as you and I are all flawed. They were not flawed men. They were very flawed men, just like you and I. But it was not founded upon people. This nation was not founded upon people, even the great ones like Adams and Washington and Madison and Jefferson and on and on and on. They were founded upon principles. And that's what these men and women are not, maybe have not had enough civics class to understand the principles. They gave us an exceptional American principles, and as I said, they were flawed, but just like you and I are flawed. Liberty is only maintained by a society grounded in a shared morality. We've talked about that, especially in the early weeks. Here's what Alexander Hamilton said: "Equal pains have been taken to deprave the morals as to extinguish the religion of the country." And he's speaking there specifically about France, because remember, France was in this evolving themselves, and it did not go well for them. It was a horrible train wreck, to use a Roger Webb term. "If indeed morality in a community can be separated from religion, the pious and moral weep over these scenes as a sepulchre destined to entomb all they revere and esteem." So again, they understood that you could not determine and develop, and certainly not maintain, some kind of morality apart from firm religious convictions. They understood that it was a combination of two equally important parts. It is freedom under the constraints of a shared morality. We talked about that a little bit in one of the beginning weeks. It is freedom under the constraints of a shared morality. It is not purely freedom. Liberty cannot survive where there is no pure freedom. Again, if we just look at the news today, you're seeing pure freedom exercised. And the result is anarchy and chaos, right? And the screaming that you're sending federal officers and, you're sending federal officers to protect federal buildings that are being torched but unrestrained for the most part. So it's unrestrained, and they would define, I suppose, as freedom, if you ask them. Pure freedom is a man doing whatever is right in his or her own mind, regardless of what it does to others. The pure freedom, then, the result is chaos. And we're seeing that. That's what you have when you have pure freedom without any moral boundaries. So, well, move on. We'll talk more about that. Now, liberty, though, cannot survive with just moral law alone. So you can't just simply inflict this moral standard without some form of liberty. Moral law not mingled with freedom is theocracy. Again, theocracy, for those who might be new tonight, when folks say you kingdom folks, that's what you want. You're talking about a theocracy. No, we're not talking about a theocracy. The founders weren't talking about a theocracy. Theocracy is Saudi Arabia, Iran, other nations, but those two will do. There's where, and now you have given segments in our nation, Minneapolis being one of them, because it has a massive, massive influx of Somalis who are Muslim, and now, of course, they have a Muslim representative from that district. I'm not slamming Somalis; they come here for freedom, but now they're in almost in effect of trying to turn that into Sharia law in Somalia or in Minneapolis. But that's what you have. Sharia law is basically this is the God you're going to serve. Period. This is how you're going to do it, and we're not interested in your freedom, but this is the moral standard. Now, theocracy in the hands of men is tyranny in the name of religion. That's what you have. It's not, when they talk about all the three great religions, Islam and Christianity and Judaism, Islam, for the most part, I mean, certainly it's exercised in freedom here, basically, and for the most part in the United States, but in other places in the world, it's not. It's tyranny. I get that? Jefferson warned, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift from God. Ben Franklin cautioned, again, we look at Franklin and Jefferson as the poster men that the liberals will say, well, these were, again, were deists or they were irreligious and so on. But boy, they sure said an awful lot about the things of faith, as you just saw there from another quote from Jefferson. But Franklin cautioned the founders during the Constitutional Convention. Watch this now. He said, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were in sensible danger. An interesting phrase, sensible danger. We had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. We talked about that last week. Every day before they began in that essentially 100-day journey of hammering out the Constitution, they had daily prayer. In this room for divine protection, all of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of superintending providence. That was a word that Franklin used over and over again, providence, providence, providence. In our favor, have we forgotten that powerful friend? So even in the midst of their back and forth, evidently they were forgetting it as well too, as so often the church does. Have we forgotten that powerful friend, or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? God governs in the affairs of men. You've heard that term, God governs in the affairs of men, came from Franklin in this quote in the Constitutional Convention. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that any empire can rise without his aid? Now, when you have mankind that amass almost godlike, unchecked power, all sense of moral restraint is tossed aside. Again, I don't mean to just keep hammering the present tense that we're viewing on the news every night, but you're seeing much of that. We have some unchecked power men and women right now in our country, and what happens is a moral restraint is tossed aside. when they have control over the mechanisms that shape society, namely government, and the institutions surrounding government, tyranny is the natural result. Tyranny is the natural result. So on one hand, we may be scratching our head and saying, why is this all happening? But you look at the folks in charge. Tyranny is the result. The nation that we are fighting for is an exceptional one, regardless of what some folks say about it, in all our flaws and failings and shortcomings, because again, you have every institution, whether that's the church or governments, businesses, are headed up by flawed men and women who make mistakes, but still founded upon exceptional principles. If those documents are destroyed, the foundation is lost. If the foundation is lost, the whole structure crumbles under the weight of the unbridled tyranny. Listen to the words of Webster. Is our Constitution worth preserving? Guard it as you would the seat of your life. Guard it not only against open blows of violence, but also against the spirit of change. Thought that was an interesting comment or phrase by Webster as well, too. Now listen, change in itself is not a bad thing if it brings around positive results. If you're going to have positive results, ultimately there's always has to be change. But the spirit of change that we're, again, seeing in much of that confronts us today seems to be Webster was maybe prophetically speaking about, not just simply about the blows of violence that are outward, but the spirit of change that says this is the way it's going to be going forward, and there's nothing you can do about it. Miracles do not cluster. That which has happened but only once in 6,000 years, he's talking about this grand nation of ours, cannot be expected to happen often. Such a government, once destroyed, would have a void to be filled perhaps for centuries. That's a scary thought. With evolution and tumult, riot, and despotism. Again, I don't want us to take the power of God out of the equation right now or what would happen going forward, but history would not be on our side. History's not been on the side of any nation that has collapsed in terms of its, especially if it had anything that resembled a constitutional democratic republic, as ours is. Now, the title of the teaching tonight is Overreach. Every single branch, regardless of the party in control, has failed us and has failed in its duty to uphold the Constitution. Let's look first at the Congress. James Madison, remember, who were the three that wrote the Federalist Papers? Pop quiz. Madison? Hamilton. James Madison's characterization of one of the fundamental powers of the House of Representatives. That's what he says here. The House of Representatives cannot only refuse, but they alone can propose the supplies requisite for the support of the government. This power of the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining the redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. Now, the power of the purse rests with the Congress. You understand, remember that from your civics class? Well, any number of problems, I wouldn't say the problem. A problem now is they're like sailors on a 3-day drunk. So we end up sending supposed physical conservatives to Washington, and then they bend under the pressure and don't. So we're going to tighten the belt. We just can't keep doing this. You know, it'd be one thing now we've just gone through a 2.2 trillion. These numbers you can't even, they're like they throw them out and what does that mean? I mean, we know that's a lot of money, but you just, 2.2 trillion. That of all of us know we did not have, right? Say, well, there had to be something done in the moment with all this COVID. Well, had we had a balanced budget at the time? So yeah, we can do 2.2 trillion. It may take us 3 years to get that reconciled and paid back and back to zero. But you had, what, 22 trillion at the time we did this, or 21 trillion? You lose track of all the numbers. Now, of course, they're hammering out another one. And you know that they're going, because the Republicans are saying this is all we're going for and you can't do this, and the Democrats are completely out here, so you know there's going to have to be compromise. It's going to be another gigantic package. Would the founders even recognize the Congress? Well, they feared what would happen in these kind of situations. They tried to put everything they could put into the Constitution to try to avert that. But I'm not sure that even in their wisdom at the time, they could have seen what it looks like now. Madison was referring to Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution as a means of keeping an out-of-control government from going over the cliff. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. So, the House of Representatives has the sole authority to fund or defund every federal program. When was the last one you heard them defund? None. That's another one of the gigantic problems. When all these things are created, they never go away. Back after the meltdown in 2008, 2009, somebody was doing some research about within the federal government, there are 70 individual departments on education. 70. All of them, of course, with funded employees and all those. And one would think that, gosh, you ought to be able to cut it down to 35 anyway, don't you think? But you'd displace a lot of federal workers, and that wouldn't be good. But the House of Representatives has the power to defund every federal program. The defunding of unconstitutional federal programs, as Madison stated, is a vital part of the governmental checks and balances that we don't see anymore, of course. That's, for the most part, going by the wayside. The Affordable Care Act. Now, I'm not here taking a political position on the Affordable Care Act. I mean, I could take one. I did take one, but just for tonight's sake, is an example of overreach. The Congress asserted power never delegated and attacked religious liberty. Inside that, they established things that they had no power and authority to do when it came to religious freedom. Now, of course, that got pushed up had to go all the way to the Supreme Court with Hobby Lobby, and now with the Sisters of the Poor, I think, had something just reconciled, although that one's not fully done. I think they're taking an early victory lap, but I don't think that one's fully done yet. But they inserted things that they had no authority to do. Again, overreach. Alexander Hamilton's view of overreach: no legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution can be valid. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution can be valid. To deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant above the master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves. It's a mouthful there. Acting by virtue of powers made not only what their, I think I went too fast on this, do not only what their powers to not authorize, but what they forbid. So, And we're not merely heading off a physical cliff, but also a potential freedom cliff as well, too. Again, I know I get pushback about this whole thing going on with COVID right now. My position on this is my concern is the Constitution. Yes. That's my concern. At some juncture, we're either going to pray this thing gone, or we'll say we'll pray it gone. Or there'll be some kind of remedy, and we'll look at it at some juncture in our rearview mirror. However, I'm going to paraphrase Franklin. Again, I've shared this in this session as well, too, I think. But Franklin said, Webb paraphrase, if you try to grab hold of, if you demand safety while still wanting liberty, you will likely lose them both. Franklin was prophetic in that regard. So we're not merely heading off a physical cliff, that being the financial aspect, but a freedom cliff as well. Here's an example. Again, not being political here, but just we're in a civics class. Everybody got that? On June 28, 2012, the House of Representatives found Attorney General Eric Holder guilty of criminal contempt. Watch this now, by a vote of 255 to 67. So you had a bunch of them that just simply said, we're going to vote here or whatever. So if you know your numbers in terms of the House of Representatives, that does not amass all the House. But for refusing to turn over the documents tied to the Fast and Furious gun running murders. Remember that? They handed out guns to essentially cartel to say we're going to find out, try to track these. And it certainly is not funny that we had agents, or at least one agent, get killed. So he refused to hand over the papers, which is certainly the domain of the House to request. They found him guilty of criminal contempt. So the next action that is required of the House by the Constitution, not Republican, not Democrat, not independent, is clear and is contained in Article 2, Section 4. This section is a directive upon Congress. The President, Vice President, and watch this now, all civil officers. Is the Attorney General a civil officer? Yes. Of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, did anything happen? No. This was, again, nothing more than a symbolic, we voted this and held you this, and nothing whatsoever. But by the Constitution, they should have taken their role to have removed him. Now, why they didn't, I'm sure it was political fear, which seems to govern much of what the men and women up there do and don't do. So, I mean, we could spend the next 15 hours on the House of Representatives. We just don't have time to do that. But now let's go to the next one, the judiciary. Here's an interesting one. Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, who says she's one of the 9 with a black robe on, right, in Washington right now, served as the dean of the Harvard Law School. Big deal. She went from law clerk to political advisor to law professor to the Supreme Court Justice. Now, say, well, who cares about that? While she is the dean of the law school at Harvard, one of the probably top 3 most prestigious law schools in the United States, she deemed at that point that constitutional law was not required for the students to graduate. Now, they could take it if they desired, but it was not required. Now, you're going to have a lawyer that comes out of any law school for that matter, but let alone Harvard, and you don't deem that the Constitution is important enough that you teach it to your students. And that woman now sits to govern as one of the 9 votes, determining whether whatever's brought before them is constitutional or is not constitutional. That's a scary thought, right? So she, gave them options of international and comparative law classes. So the question is that action lined up with somebody whose values of America's founding documents seem to be important? We sure doesn't seem to be. But even if you take constitutional law in law school, this does not mean you'll actually learn the Constitution. Instead, here seems to be the focus now, and even in constitutional law, it's what's called precedent. Precedent essentially means that men and women in black robes know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. So, precedent means if it's coming up the lower courts and they determine in this particular case, this is the ruling, they would then look at that as potentially, anyway, precedent. So if that tracks through the process, if it continues to try to be pushed up, or they try to push it up through higher courts, if they finally don't override that, it just simply is based on precedent rather than what the Constitution says. Are they tracking on that? So what the founders feared has certainly come to pass. The judiciary authorizing the power of lawmaking through the sanction of federal regulations. They've upheld the authority of unconstitutional regulatory agencies. Now, we have as I said, now these are not federal agencies, but this is an example again. You have 70 departments within the Department of Education, federally. Doesn't count the state, that's federal. 70 departments within the Department of Education. Now, regulatory agencies, they're what I call the alphabet. FTC, FCC, SEC, and that's not the Southeastern Conference, that's, and on and on. Say, what's the big deal about those? They enact things that essentially become law. Here's the problem. Those agencies have no authority to establish law, right? Again, I'm not making a political statement here, one about unions or non-unions. Don't go down that path. A few years ago, it was under the Obama administration, governed by the FTC, which is a 3-person board. Boeing wanted to move a plant to South Carolina, which is a right-to-work state. Well, they didn't like that. By they, meaning the FTC. Wait a minute. You're going to take it to a non-union state. That's what right-to-work is. So they prevented at the interim this interaction between Boeing and the state of South Carolina. So you have an agency, not, how will I put it? Yeah, well, finally got that unwound and that got changed, but these federal agencies do not have the authority to create law. Only the Congress has the authority to create law. In addition, they will exert fines, which are just an undercover way of taxing them, which they also don't have the right to do, right?
We didn't vote them in either.
We didn't vote them in either. That's exactly right. Those the 3-person on that FTC or the SEC or the FCC or the XYZ or the K, nobody votes them, right? They're appointed. And yet they're making decisions that in effect become law, which they have no authority to do. They fine entities, which in effect become tax, but they can't call them a tax because they're not authorized to tax us. So in effect, it becomes back to one of the opinions of the what happened with the whole pulling back from England was taxation what? Without representation. Who in turn usurp power of the states. The courts themselves usurp the power of the states by sanctioning government's control over powers reserved to the states. Example is the voting requirements. a power reserved to the states through Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution. That's the state's domain. The result, gradual takeover of this arena by the federal government, with the result being voter fraud running rampant. And boy, if we don't have one this time, it'll be because the saints have got to pray and push back. And everybody knows that. Both sides of the aisle know this will be, but one side doesn't particularly care. They want that way. Now, again, back to our Federalist guy, James Madison, had to say about court-sanctioned expansion of federal authority. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Think about that. They established the Constitution with the viewpoint that the federal powers would be few and defined. Now, how many think that's gone completely obliterated? It's certainly not few when you, again, think about that. And you know that that's the 70 sub-departments within the education department is not an isolation of itself. You think that runs rampant with every other department, where hundreds and thousands of people are being paid to push stuff around. Federal government, and come up with more and more and more rules. That way you justify your existence as a employee. Are few and defined. Those which remain in the state's governments, watch this now, are numerous and indefinite. So Madison says, certainly echoing what they were trying to do with the Constitution, the federal hands, as it were, things they could do, powers are few and defined. Those which remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Federal powers will be exercised primarily on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which the last power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. What does that tell us? The taxation should be pointed towards our foreign needs and commerce and so on. That makes sense, rather than a nation trying to deal with all, as they said about the Articles of Confederation, foreign nations were concerned with trying to deal with individual states who all had their own money. There was no central money. Remember we talked about that last week. So it would make sense from a federal standpoint to deal with the foreign aspect, war, peace, commerce, etc. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. Madison makes it clear that external, meaning primarily foreign duties, are the powers delegated to the federal government, and everything else not expressly delegated remains in the hands of the people through their states. But among many other problems is we, that being states, have given so much power. They've handed it over. The feds say, hand this over and we will send you money. So we relinquish as states, which now that is so blurred that I don't know that we even states understand. They talk about states' rights. Occasionally that pops up, but not very often. But we've simply given over to the federal government so much of what should be the domain of states. So the founders essentially believed that the federal courts would be a bastion of defense against federal overreach. That's one of the areas that they saw, certainly that with Congress and the Senate as well too, but they saw the judiciary as a wall of defense against overreach by the federal government. That's pretty much gone by the wayside as well, too. Now, finally, the executive branch, in all candor, has done no better record than the other two. Again, let me say, on either side of the aisle, so this is not Democrat, Republican, both of them. Executive agencies create law but call them regulations. We talked about that earlier. So they have these non-elected men and women heading up these executive agencies. They create law in effect, but they call them regulations because they can't call them law because they can't create law. I got it? It's not within their domain to create law. To avoid a charge of violating separation of powers, they tax people but call them fines. Remember in the Affordable Care Act, finally, if you remember, when it finally went to the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts, who didn't want to kill it, or he wanted to kill it, but he was afraid to kill it. He didn't have enough guts to say, this is unconstitutional. So what he did, if you remember, he in the Affordable Care Act, it was listed as a fine. And he said, no, it's not a fine, it's a tax. So he wavered in the fact that he wouldn't vote to say it's unconstitutional, the thing needs to die. He didn't have enough courage to do that, I guess, but he didn't allow them to levy this fine. He said, no, that's a tax. You got to call it what it is, a tax. So, resulting in a modern-day manifestation of the grievance of taxation without representation. Now, we hear about these all the time, executive orders, right? We tend to maybe okay them or not turn our nose so much at them if it's our guy making the executive orders. Okay, so it's okay if our guy, whoever our guy is, to make the executive orders. And then we don't like it when the guy we don't like is making the executive orders. But did you know that, again, constitutionally, the executive orders were for the executive branch to govern their own departments? That was the narrow focus of executive orders. Not to broad scale, again, whether you're Democrat or Republican. And they get frustrated. You know, you see the frustration of the Democrat president with Republican-controlled House. You see the Republican frustrated with a Democrat House. But now I know it's virtually impossible now with the vitriol. It gets worse and worse and worse. It just doesn't seem like either side, it's about governing, it's about winning points. Let's win our battles here. So again, I don't know that the founders would have ever envisioned this kind of hostility. I mean, they had hostility, certainly, they had hostility in trying to form the Constitution. But their belief was, you guys need to figure this out. So you as the president need to go down the street and get that group of men and women to somehow you guys come together. That was, again, part of the separation of the powers, but one of the controlling mechanisms was that is if you have this that you want to get done, you're going to have to convince them that this is what should be done. And you're going to have to get enough of them to vote for that. Rather than saying, you're not going to do it, so I'm just going to do this executive order. Again, we tend to say, well, if it's the right guy, we're all right with it. But that was never the intent. Executive orders were to help govern your own executive departments. Writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law without the consent of the legislative branch is an old tool used by tyrannical kings to destroy the liberties of the people. But I get it. I know that they get frustrated, so I'm going to do this anyway. But then you understand that the next fellow or woman in the White House can do what? Completely undo it. As Trump, the current president, has undone many of those that President Obama did. Why? Because they're not law. Now, had they gone down the street and the House and the Senate pass this bill, whatever number, then you can't go in then as the president or the judiciary and say, well, listen, the judiciary says that's, you overreach there and you can't do that and it's not constitutional. But you certainly can overturn executive orders, and they do. They were not intended to be constitutionally enforceable on the people, but simply rule-making procedures for the executive branch, again, to help manage its own internal operation. The problem is that Congress has given the executive branch the power to make law by setting up regulatory agencies, which again ends up being simply a workaround. So we create this agency because we can't get this done, so we'll create this agency. We'll appoint men and women here who are unelected by the people, and then we'll basically attempt to govern that way. They're executive branch regulatory agencies or executive branch agencies established by the legislative branch to control and to be controlled by the executive branch. Though these agencies, or through these agencies, executive orders are enforced upon us through regulatory laws, again, that they do not have any power to establish. Those agencies do not have that power, and yet we have essentially done what? We've given them that power.
The Internal Revenue Service would take your home and all your property.
Sure they could. Sure they can. Executive orders are an unconstitutional use of legislative power. Again, no matter which guy signs it. In truth, they're unconstitutional use of legislative power, either by the theft of power or by consent of the Congress. It really doesn't make any difference whether it's whichever one of those it falls on, theft of power, or just simply the Congress rolls over and consents. It really doesn't make any difference. Because of separation of powers, the president is not authorized to constitutionally to write, set aside, or overturn law. That is the power delegated to the legislature. These regulatory agencies are unconstitutional entities. The federal government was never delegated the power to regulate internal affairs of the states in such a manner. If you want a complete reading of that, Federal Paper 45. I would have put it in your notes, but it's way long. Way long. And that one, of course, was one of Madison's explanations of limited federal power. Now, okay, what's the answer to this? And we can just simply throw up our hands and say, it's a muddy mess, and what do you do? Well, it's the same as it's always been. This is not a kingdom. We are a constitutional republic. It's our duty and right to remove them who will violate the principles. Shame on us if we continue to send these men and women back to Washington who continue to do the same things. So we cry and moan and do this, that, and the other, but if we continue to send them, and we shouldn't, again, I have very little trust now in lifetime politicians on either side of the aisle. They're institutions that I say very little trust. It doesn't make a difference whether elephants or donkeys if they've been there for 30, 40, 50 years. Now, how you get term limits when they've got to handle it, that seems to be frustrating. But when they say we're going to be physically conservative and we're going to handle on this, and they go up there and then don't do that, then we talk about a house cleaning, but the end result or needed result is a house cleaning. again, largely on both sides of the aisle. But that was the remedy that the founders gave us, and that has not changed. All right. A little bit early. Comments, questions before we let you go? The question for those of you who are watching online is, this seems to be, of course, a major failure in our two-party system, as to whether the founders saw that would work that way or would not work that way, and either did or didn't build things into it or should have built more into it in terms of the Constitution. I mean, they had.
I think we need only to look at maybe the German system to see the multitude of different parties that everybody comes to the table, and I think it leads to less decision making because there's too many people with different approaches coming to the table.
You have. You have that within the German system. You have it to some extent with Israel, with their multiple parties. Then you end up, I don't know so much about Germany, but in Israel and England, for instance, and then you have to get a coalition that you got to bring with you of the other, maybe a minor group in terms of their representation. You got to convince them to come over. Well, I believe that if whether we have two parties or five parties, if they would adhere to the Constitution, I think that's what the men said. If you'll preserve it and maintain it and live by it, don't obliterate it in the process, then we can probably make this work. Oh, sure there is.
As you stated, the civics lesson tonight, you could go out and ask millennials who won the Civil War, and you probably wouldn't get the correct answer.
True.
So the problem for me is education. And because of lack of education, they're looking to others to tell them what to do. Yeah.
Right.
We need to fill the void of telling them what to do.
The comments, again, if you can't hear it from on the recording, is a very true statement. If you went out and asked millennials now who won the Civil War, they probably would get that wrong. Sadly, but that's likely the case. That education is a huge missing piece in the. If you take, again, the simple civics out of the classroom, but you also. Now, again, what we're seeing is the attempted obliteration of history. Now, that's another thing the Germans did or attempted to do, was to obliterate history. Now, you don't strengthen a nation going forward by just simply trying to obliterate its history. We have bad people, we had folks, but again, you had individuals who were flawed. But the principles were of grand nature that they put in place. So we need, if you don't teach our history and all of it, not just a skewed viewpoint and leaving out much of it, when you have a congresswoman who is on the vice president's short list of potential vice president running mates that called all the men on the Mount Rushmore as dead traitors, quote unquote. They're just dead traitors. Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and who's the fourth one? Is it Roosevelt? Anyway, somebody Google that real quick. But here's a woman who is a representative now in the she's a senator, I think. Called them dead traitors. You got a problem when your folks in Washington, were they flawed? Yes, they were flawed. All of them were flawed. You and I are flawed. Those ones throwing the rocks and pulling down statues are flawed. But, education is a huge piece of it that we sorely missing now. And you as parents, you should be checking in your schools, your middle schools and your high schools, what they're teaching and what they're not teaching. If you want the very grassroots things that need to be done, start here, like with electing people in righteous governance here in councilmen and women and mayors and so forth, and you need to be checking with your school systems. Don't just assume that, I hope it's all right. You may have to raise a stink. You may not be a real popular parent in your school district, but better be finding out what they're teaching in civics, if anything, what they're teaching in history, if anything, and what they're leaving out. And some things now that in some states are mandatory. LGBT now is becoming a mandatory course. I forget, that's all things. I think Texas has already put that in place, I think. Could be wrong on that, Texas or Arizona. Roosevelt, okay, right. Okay, 8:25. Let's pray. Father, thank you again for people hungry here and online, that we're not just, I pray, Lord, just simply not gleaning information, but that we're amassing revelatory understanding and ammunition to be the men and women of the Constitution that we're to be. That we'll do it with wisdom, and we can help instruct others and be tools in your hand, not just simply for the kingdom of God, but in righteousness, broadly speaking, to this nation and our region that we have, that you've given us sphere of influence over, whether it's our local townships and our communities and our individual schools that our children are in, that you've placed us there to be light and salt with the glory of Jesus Christ and the rights, Father, of rightly ours of this nation. We thank you for it, Father. Use us over these next few days before we gather again. Protection on every one of us, Father, and our families. And Lord, may we be kingdom people that share the good news, pray for the sick, release joy and your kingdom to scores of lives before we gather in here again on Sunday. Thank you for Doc Barkley being with us, Lord. Thank you. That's going to be an impact blowing up in this given region, Father, for the glory of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thanks, guys. See you Sunday.